Hi everyone, it's Benitez here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is part 2 of my series where I show you how to automate generating a PDF and attach it to an outbound email that will be sent to a customer. For today's WTF episode, I'm going to show you how you can create a custom connector for Dynamics 365 in Power Automate. For the agenda, I will do a quick recap of why I'm doing multiple WTF episodes. Then I'm going to talk about the process and flow components and the 2 Dynamics 365 API requests that I'll be calling. And then we're going to jump straight into the demo. I decided to do multiple WTF episodes because there was simply too much to fit in a single episode. So in part 1, you saw me share with you all how you can create a Word template for Dynamics 365. And as I mentioned today, I'll be showing you how you can create a custom connector for Dynamics 365 in Power Automate. So in terms of the process and the flow components, it will be when the invoice status reason is updated to paid, that will trigger a flow in my Power Automate, and then eventually the customer will receive that PDF that was generated by the flow in the form of a file attachment to that email. So I will be going through a couple of Dynamics 365 API requests, and then I'm going to show you how you can create those API requests as actions in the custom connector in Dynamics 365. So the 2 Dynamics 365 API requests is the ExportPdf document. This was released by the Dynamics 365 product team last year. And then the other API request that we're going to use today is the activitymimeattachments. A reminder of the use case, it will be as a customer, I want to receive a text receipt of my purchase in an email so that I have confirmation of my purchase. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the demo. So the ExportPdf document API request that was released last year is applicable in the Sales Hub Dynamics 365 app, and in this docs.microsoft.com article it'll explain this new feature. So in the command or in the ribbon there will be 2 options that you can select. There will be one called Create PDF and one called Email as PDF. Today, this is what we call an on-demand process for an end user, where they need to open a particular record and they need to click on either of those commands. But what we want to do here is automate it, and that is what I'll be showing you through the use of a custom connector, where we are going to call this export PDF document API request, and then everyone else in that tenant can use that same action. Okay, so I'm gonna go over to a blog post that one of my friends in the Microsoft MVP family wrote. His name is Stefan. So I met Stefan last year in Netherlands when I was doing my eWorld tour. Hey Stefan and the rest of Netherlands, if you are watching this episode. And he did this blog post last year where he gave credit to another person in the community that shared how to do this automatically using Power Automate and the API. And I know what you're thinking, hey Stefan has already blogged about this, why are you doing this episode? And the reason I'm doing this episode is because in Stefan's flow, what he is doing is using an invoke an HTTP request action. And the thing with that particular action is if you use that action in, let's say, a flow where it is triggered using the action when a record is selected, what will happen is they will be presented with a prompt where they need to enter in information such as the base resource URL and the Azure AD resource URI. In terms of the end user experience, it might freak them out because they're not going to know what they need to enter, because at the end of the day we are working with end users that may not necessarily have that knowledge on how to enter this information. And so by using a custom action in a custom connector and having all of that already prepared for them, they don't need to worry about it. So it'll make sense when I show you this, as well as in WTF episode number 26, which will be the next one after this one. And so what Stefan here is doing is that he has kindly shared the JSON, which is what I'm going to apply in the custom action. Now, before we create a custom connector in Power Automate, what we need to do is create a new app registration in the Azure portal, and we need to associate that to our Dynamics 365 instance so that it can use that information that we create in the app registration as part of the authentication of that custom connector. So I'm going to head over to the Azure portal and I'm going to create a new app registration. There are articles that have already been created on how to do this, or blog posts, so I'm just going to quickly show you how you do it. So we can give it a name and we can hit register. I'll come back to that redirect URI as we create the custom connector, and there's a couple of more things that you need to do. So the first one is we need to enable API permissions for Dynamics 365. So you head over to API permissions, add a new permission, and select this option here. And then we need to tick this checkbox, and then our permissions will be granted for this particular app registration. The next bit that we need to do is create a new client secret, because this is what our custom connector in Power Automate will use. And I'll set it to never. And we'll see that there's a client secret that has been generated. So I'm going to copy that and just dump it into Notepad, because we're going to use it later on when we create that custom connector. Okay, so I'm going to go back to overview and just leave that there because we're going to come back to this. Okay, so now that we've created our app registration in the Azure portal, the next thing that we need to do is start creating our custom connector in Power Automate. So expand data, and the option that you want to select is custom connectors. We're going to create a brand new custom connector from blank, and I'm going to give this a name. And then this is where we can select some icons if we want, as well as use an icon background color. So I'm going to choose a particular icon. So this is from Icons 8, and we can also give it a background color. So I'm going to use like a dark navy blue. There we go. And in terms of the connection, it's going to be HTTPS. And then for the host, it is simply the URL of our organization without the HTTPS. So I'm just going to copy that bit of the URL and paste it into here. And then I'm going to select Create Connector. So this will now create the connector for Dynamics 365. And I can then go ahead and enter the security authentication type. Oops, sorry, I needed to click edit. And I'm going to select OAuth 2.0. And we're going to select the Azure Active Directory. And then this is where I can grab the details from my app registration. So the client ID is this value here. So we paste it in, and the next thing that we need is the client secret. So go back to my notepad and paste it into here. For the resource URL, it is the URL of the organization for my Dynamics 365 instance, and we leave the scope as is. So I'm going to select Update Connector. And the next bit is important, where we will see that there's now a redirect URL. So we need to copy this and head back to your app registration and select a redirect URI. Oops. I just pasted it into the wrong area. Okay, so now we need to select Add a Platform, select Web, and enter in that value in there, and then select Configure. And so now that has been created. Okay, so back in Power Automate, now that we've sorted out the authentication method for this custom connector that's going to communicate with Dynamics 365, the next step is where we can go ahead and create the two custom actions where we are going to call the ExportPdfDocument API as per Stefan's blog post, and then I'm also going to call an API that will create the email attachment for the email message. Okay, so in terms of the definition area, when you create your custom connector, you have two options. There's a trigger and there's action. So today we're going to use action. So I'm going to create a brand new one, and I'm going to call this one generatepdf. And then it's asking for an ID, so I'll just leave it as that. And then this is where we can start creating the actual request. So I select import from sample, and you're going to be presented with the methods of how you want to call the API request. So I'm going to select post, and then in terms of the URL, it will be the one that Stefan has reference, which is this one. So I'm just going to head over to my Visual Studio Code and just copy and paste it. So I prepared this earlier. And then in terms of the JSON body, so if we take a look at the JSON that is available in Stefan's blog post, it's got an entity type code reference. So this will be a reference to the actual record. And then we also have the selected template, so it's binding it to a particular document template ID, and it's saying generate against this particular record. So if I go back to my Visual Studio Code, we're going to copy and paste something that I've created earlier. So this 1090 represents the invoice entity because we are creating the PDF from the invoice entity. Okay, so now when I select import, it will go ahead and validate it, and if there's no errors, then that red exclamation mark will go away. And that is simply how you create your action against your custom connector for Dynamics 365. And one of the cool things that I love about Power Automate is you can actually perform a test directly in the custom connector, which I'll show you now. So the first thing that you need to do is create a connection, and we're just simply going to use my credentials. So we need a connection in order to test the API request. So then here is where we can then copy and paste some details. So the entity type code is 1090. And then, and then I can copy and paste this value. And then we want the document template ID. So in terms of the document template ID that I am going to use, pretty much you would head over to your Power Platform Admin Center. You select the option called templates, and then you click document templates. And that will present you with a list of templates that you can use. And the template that I'm going to use is this one. So all I need to do is grab that ID and paste it into here. And then for the actual invoice record, I need to reference an invoice ID so that we can test it as part of our API request. Now, if you were to click test operation right now, this is going to fail because the JSON body is expecting some additional characters. So if I go back to Stefan's blog post, you see how there's some additional characters in here. So we've got the square brackets, a backslash, and quotes. So in here, what I need to do is add in that additional characters because the response expects it as like a string of arrays, if that makes sense. I have left out the backslash because if you include the backslash, it's going to fail. I am not a developer, so I can't explain that bit, but if there are other pro devs in the community that are watching this right now, maybe you know the reason behind it. It's just that when I was doing trial and error, I found that this successfully worked without the backslash. Okay, so fingers crossed this is going to work when I click test operation. So what we're going to do is we're going to click this button, and what we should get as the response is a base 64 string that represents the PDF file that has been generated. So we can see that it's called that API and that it successfully generated that PDF because this is the base 64. Okay, so that's the generate PDF document API action done. The next thing that we want to do is create one more new action where it's going to create an email attachment, and we're going to call a different API request this time. So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to explain why I am using a custom action to call the activitymimeattachment API rather than using like a CDS action that is available in Power Automate. Today, if I want to include my flow in a solution, and if I try use one of the attachment actions in the, I think it's bound or unbound, I can't remember, for the CDS current environment connector, it's going to fail. And then there is another way that you can create an email attachment using the standard CDS connector. So this has been blogged about by another person in our Microsoft community here in New Zealand. His name is Lynn. So I will provide that in my blog post if you want to go ahead and check it out. But when I created this originally, which was probably at the beginning of this year, I was using a custom action because back then that was how I solved it, as in like getting it to work without an error occurring whenever I tried to use a CDS current environment connector. Sorry, that took a while to come out of my mouth. And because I was already creating a custom action for my custom connector where I'm generating the PDF, I thought, okay, well, I might as well do it while I'm here to create that email attachment. And then this way, anyone else in the tenant can also use the same action if they want to as well. So that's one of the things that I like about the custom connector. Yeah, okay, so in terms of the API request that I'm calling, it is this fella over here. And then in terms of the JSON body, I actually had a look at someone else's blog post. So this blog site is called One Dynamics, and they have shared the details of how you can call that API, and basically it will need to bind to an activity ID. It requires a base 64, and then you can give it a file name and subject as well. So that's what I'm going to show you next. Okay, so back in my custom connector in Power Automate, we are going to create a request, and it's a post as well. And as I mentioned, we are calling the activity mime API request, which I'll copy and paste into my connector. And then we go ahead and do the same for the body. So this is the details that you would have seen in that One Dynamics blog post that I just showed you. Again, I will provide the link to that blog post in my blog post, so make sure you go ahead and check it out as well. Okay, so I've now created that action, and I'm going to update the connector, and then we're going to go ahead and perform a test. Okay, so select the operation of create email attachment, and so I need to bind this to a particular activity, which will be an email. So let's do that now. And I'll use this email that I have prepared. So I'm going to grab that ID, and then we're going to paste it into here. And then in terms of the object type code, it's email. And then in terms of a body, it requires base 64. So I'm just going to create a simple one and copy and paste it into there. Did that work? Let me just do that again. Okay. So this is just a simple site that allows you to apply base 64. So you want to select encode, not decode. So I'm going to put it in there, and then I'm going to give it a file name. And then a subject. And then we're going to go ahead and test the operation. Okay, so we can see that it has successfully created. So if I go back to my email activity, it should appear in here. So when I click refresh, we should see that file has been created. And if we download it, just to show you that it is in fact the file that was created through the API request, and there you go. So that is what I had entered as my base 64. And we can see that it's working beautifully. Okay, so that is how you create a custom connector for Dynamics 365. So what I'll show you next is what it will look like to someone when they're creating a flow. So in other words, a flow maker. So for the purpose of this demo, I will choose the manually trigger a flow so that I can show you what the custom connector looks like and what those custom actions look like as well. So in here, I'm going to select the option custom, and here is my Dynamics 365 custom connector that I had created. And then we can see my two actions that we created. So if I select generate PDF, so now the flow maker simply just needs to enter in these details. So the entity type code, in other words, the invoice, the value for this, the ID of the document template, and then the ID of that particular invoice. And then likewise with the other action that we had created, where it will create an email attachment and bind it to a particular email record. Same thing, it's going to ask you for this information. So make sure you stay tuned and watch my next WTF episode as part of this PDF automation series, because you're going to see this in action. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!
Turn up. Let's go.